Hey everybody, welcome back to lab. This is lab 5. We're going to talk about tissues real quick. This lab is a bit different than normal. Let's take a look. Okay, so you're going to go on a quick and intense tour of the tissues of our body. Now we have over, 200 different cell types in our body, and as they start to organize and work together, they become tissues, okay? And let's look at how you're going to investigate them. Now this lab is a little bit different than others in that you don't have a simulation the same way you do with the other ones. It is really helpful if you if you kind of get used to these words. They're root words that we use in anatomy a lot, or just science in general, and you can start to put things together. So if you have an adipocyte or an adipocyte, that's a fat cell. You have a chondrocyte, that's a cartilage cell, etc. So you'll start to see those things start to pop up as you, if you're kind of learning them. You might even learn them by accident, okay? So for example, if we have something we can kind of figure out, like cuboidal means it looks like a cube, that kind of thing. Okay, so how are we doing this? In this lab, you're going to see there's lots of words, there's lots of pictures. We're starting to get into the actual intense anatomy part of this class, of the labs. Remember, the anatomy is the structure, a little bit of the function, and you'll see in tissues, you really start to see that the way the cells are shaped and the way the tissue is shaped, you really start to see that structure and function work together. For example, if you look at these epithelial cells that just line things versus the bone cells, which have to be organized in a certain way so they're both strong and flexible. Okay, so how are you going to do this? All right, so you're going to go to, if this link doesn't work straight from the lab, you're going to go to in your book. Okay, so let's say I'm in my book. I'm going to go, so I'm on MPC, under a Canvas site. I go click on McGraw-Hill, connect. I go to my connect section. I don't know exactly what yours looks like, but I'm going to go to the book. If you didn't know already, don't look at that. That's very scary. If you didn't know already, you can access the book through this portal. Very helpful. And you're going to go to chapter 5. Tissues. Okay, within chapter 5, by the way, while we're here, you'll notice some things are grayed out, some things are highlighted. I don't do that. The book does that by just automatically. I hate it, so I always turn it off. It makes me bananas, okay? So there's not so much text that you need to worry about what, just read it and you'll be fine, okay? Anyway, the point of this being, when you're in, let's go to the beginning, let's go to the introduction. So in the introduction, at the end of each section, there is a link to this APR, which means Anatomy and Physiology Revealed module, and this module 3 is the one you're looking at. So if you're using Chrome, it should open automatically. I'm not sure about the other browsers, but it just opens automatically in Chrome. And what you can do is have your lab either print it out or go back and forth, or maybe you have an iPad that you can write on, whatever, where you are. So let this set up. It might take a few. Oh, I think it's ready. Okay, so I'm going to hit, let's see, I'm in tissues. Good. Play. I need to go through and look at all different parts. So it's very helpful since, you could read the lab, or you could also let these videos play and take notes on them as they go. Okay, so each one is pretty short. Close. Okay, there's 4, you're going to see there are 4 kinds of tissue. We are going to cover in this lab the first 3. The nervous tissue, you don't have to go over right now because we're going to go over it in way more detail later. Also, with the muscle tissue, we're going to go into that in much more detail later also. So you just have to know the general skeletal muscle for this lab. And it tells you all of this as you go through the lab. All right, so I'm going to switch back and forth. Okay, here's everything I need to know first. So here are all the things that are fair game for my lab practical. You'll notice that we're starting to ramp up the number of things per lab that you need to know. Guys, there's a lot of stuff in the body. This is nothing. Wait till we get to the skeleton. It's bananas. Okay, so on the lab practical, you might be given a picture of a cell and then asked to label different parts, or a picture of tissue and asked to label the parts. So this is a good place for you to go through and be like, okay, simple squamous epithelium. What do they look like? What's their function? And you'll see I filled this one out for you. Okay, so these figures all come from your book, but I do also recommend Googling different pictures so you can see what they look like from different sources, because they're all going to have the same flat scale-like structure if they are squamous epithelial cells, simple squamous epithelial. So squamous means scale, so these kind of cover the regions that they exist on in kind of a scale-like pattern. They overlap a little bit, but they kind of loosely stick together. And what that means is they allow for stuff to pass through them very easily, okay? So you need that kind of thing in the lungs and in the digestive system. So epithelial tissue, that's our first class of tissues. They just cover stuff. They are what interacts with either the outside world or the inside of organs before it gets into the body proper, okay? So epithelial cells are always going to be on top of connective tissue, which is another kind of tissue, okay? So this is looking at it from above, this is looking at a cross section, and you'll see this layer here is the epithelial tissue. This is some connective tissue. What kind? Oh, you'll learn soon. Okay, you'll learn. So as you go through, you're going to see, okay, so let's go back over here. Epithelial tissue. So this is going to go through, it's going to take all of 6 minutes to go through the different kinds of epithelial tissue. Oh, yeah. Thanks. Okay, shush. So I recommend you listen to it also, but it'll also, it's nice because it goes into it tells you a lot of different things. Now, you only need to know the things that I give you in the lab. So you'll notice this goes into, the lab goes into, as far as, there's a lot of different kinds of epithelial cells. You need to know the simple squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. And also the stratified squamous. There we go. Whatever. Okay. But there's a bunch more. Okay. So stratified just means layers. So there are stratified columnar, there's pseudo-columnar, etc. None of those are necessary for this lab. But so basically make sure as you're going through this, you're taking notes on what is actually relevant to the lab, because these are the things I'm going to be pulling questions from for the lab practicals. Okay. So you'll see it goes on from squamous, it goes on to the cuboidal. Guess what? They look like cubes. Oh, we're going to talk about what happens between these cells in the lecture 5. You will notice that lecture 5 diverts a bit from the lab. Just there's no good overlap in the way that our schedule works for them to be the same thing. That happens a little bit. It's all good. It's going to be fine. Oh, here's some columnar cells. Guess what? They look like columns. And these kind of things include goblet cells, or the cells of our intestine, which are really long, and they allow for one side to do one thing while the other side does something else. So therefore it is polar. For example, the goblet cells are what release the acids into our stomach. Okay, and this is our stratified squamous. You'll notice, oh, it's a bunch of squamous cells, so those flat ones layered. Oh, okay, so your video will tell you more about that. And then there's some practice questions. Where are you going to find this stuff? Cool. And then it goes into connective tissue. Connective tissue are the most complicated. We don't go into it in this lab, but actually blood is a connective tissue, because it literally connects different parts of the body, okay? So it brings messengers, it brings fluids, it brings chemical signals, it brings food to all parts of the body. So technically, blood is a connective tissue. Weird. But we go into blood in way more detail later, so that's not included here. You will need to know about the looser areolar connective tissue. Okay, so this is what's right underneath our skin. It's in some other places. It's very loose, but you'll see these fibers. Those fibers let things the fibers exist in what's called the matrix, or the extracellular matrix, or the outside of these cells, to kind of connect everything together. Okay, that's good when it's in our skin, right? We want that stuff to be connected. Then we're going to go into our adipose tissue, so you'll take some notes on this. Notice there's places for you as you watch the videos to take more notes. Okay, your adipose tissue are your fat tissues. Every single person on the planet has fat cells. If you don't, you die. There's something called rabbit sickness, which is where, and I may have mentioned this in the lecture, where if you don't eat any fat, you cannot make adipose tissue. You can't make your cell membranes, you can't make neurons, and you will die. So to not eat fat is to die. Okay, so don't freak out. Fat is good everything in certain amounts is good for you. And anytime you go over, it's bad. I mean, not everything. Cyanide's never good for you. Okay, moving on. Okay, so adipose tissues. How would I know if I was given a picture that this is an adipose tissue and not, say, a squamous tissue? Well, squamous epithelial cells have their nucleus is in the center, and it's very centered. Okay, they're very they kind of have a blobby whatever shape. Okay, wow, and like if you look at them this way, they're very, very flat. The cuboidal ones are cubic. Okay. and the columnar ones are very long, with the nucleus being at the bottom, usually. What's happening here? Who knows? Things happen. The practical will only give you normal looking cells, by the way. But as opposed to the adipose tissue, where there's the fat droplet in it can get so big that it pushes everything else to the in the cell to the sides. So instead of it being in the center, like in their squamous cells, they're pushed all the way to the side. Now, this is how things like diabetes can happen. These cells can get bigger and bigger and bigger. So if you are gaining weight, it's not because you're gaining more fat cells. It's that you're loading up your fat cells with more fat droplets. As those cells get bigger, the receptors on their surfaces, which are get activated by insulin, get further and further apart, so it's harder for insulin to make them work, and then you can get type 2 diabetes. Not great. All right. But again, we need, you'll go through and see why these are actually really important. It's important for energy storage, insulation, and padding. Otherwise, we die. Okay. Then you'll go into your dense regular connective tissue. So your dense connective tissue, they're always kind of in these floppy lines, okay? You'll notice this nuclei are kind of wherever. Oh, sorry, these are fibroblasts. So fibroblasts are what make fibers, because blast means to make, because of course it does. Okay, so you'll notice there's lots of fibers. They're very wavy, okay? Kind of looks like an abstract painting. Whereas your loose connective tissue, or the areolar, whatever, they're kind of everywhere, okay? So there are fibers in it. The cells are everywhere. It's a big mess. It's very different from your dense connective tissue. Okay, you go on, you'll see there are two kinds of cartilage. There's a kind of cartilage like what connects your ribs to your sternum, and then there's a kind of cartilage you find like in your ear. Okay, the whole point of cartilage is that it gives you some flexibility and some strength to different parts of your body. So one of the professors describes it as old dried out jello that you find in the back of your refrigerator. Guys, clean your fridge. These are what make these are called chondrocytes. So chondra means cartilage, cyte means cell, makes sense. And they make this kind of matrix so that you can have some structure to what you have. So this is important if you think about something like our ears. It doesn't really matter anymore. If we were animals that could move our ears, it would be really important that they could move around without breaking. That would be bad. In the case of our lungs, it's good to have cartilage connecting the ribs to the sternum, because as we breathe in, it can expand, and as we breathe out, the sternum and the rib cage pushes down on our lungs and squishes all the air out. We'll talk much more about that later. If these were really hard, or if it was all bone, we wouldn't be able to do that. Okay, keep on going, keep on. Okay, here's that elastic cartilage. This is what we find in our ears. Again, it's much more flappy. It can move around, whereas this really only moves in one direction. This can move in 3 directions. Okay. And then so that's lots. That's our fourth kind of connective tissue. The fifth kind of connective tissue you need to know is the bone, or bone tissue. So bone inside of you is very, very alive. It's not like when you find a skull somewhere and it's very hard and just dead, and it basically tells you something's dead and it's bad. Blah. No, when bones are in your body, they're very wet. They're very alive. They're full of blood vessels. They're full of nutrients. They're a huge calcium source in your body. Okay, so you're going to learn the osteon, or a bone region, a bone fiber, basically. Okay. So you'll be able to look at this, and this is in your book as well. Okay, so the osteon is this whole thing. Then you'll have the lamellae, you have the central canals, or the Haversham canals. I think either one's fine. The caniculi are these little pathways where blood can come through if it wants. I think it's blood, where more nutrients can come feed the cell, etc. So in this micrographs, anytime you see a picture from a microscope, it's called a micrograph. So graph means picture, micro means small. Okay, so here is an osteocyte. So you can see osteocytes inside here. They travel around and they build up the bone. Or you'll see osteoclasts, which are the ones that break it down. Okay, and that becomes important. We'll talk about it later. Just make sure you can identify what the different parts of the bone are. Okay, all right, so a big thing is, what's the difference between bone and cartilage? So cartilage does not have a blood supply, which means it can't heal easily. So if you break a bone versus spraining an ankle, it takes a lot longer to heal from a sprained ankle than a broken leg bone, or not leg bone, a broken ankle bone, because the ankle bone will be getting all these nutrients and things to help it grow again, whereas the cartilage just kind of has to do its best and hope it doesn't mess it up, right? So this kind of gives you a nice example. So cartilage have chondrocytes, where whereas the bones have osteocytes, but they both exist in lacunae. So what does that mean? That means that within the cartilage there are these big open spots where the cells can travel. Same thing in the bone, there are these big open spots where the cells can travel, okay? Why is it called a lacunae? It kind of looks like a moon. That's what lacuna means. I don't know. Okay, so what is the matrix of cartilage? Cartilage is mostly, it's surrounded by protein and water, while bone is surrounded by calcium. We know that. That's what makes the chunky part of the bones. Okay, I'm not going to go through and read all of this. This is something very important for you to know. Hint, hint. Okay, and then there's some more, so that's all of the connective tissues you need to know. That's plenty. And then there's some more questions on it, okay? Excellent. Practice. These, by the way, the questions in this lab are for you to practice. It's the Lab 5 question set that you'll turn in, okay? Moving on to the skeletal muscle. So the third type of tissue we're talking about is muscle. There are 3 types of muscle. All you need to be able to label is the skeletal muscle, but you need to be able to compare the 3 types, okay? So you'll notice that smooth muscle, if you look at pictures, they're kind of spindly, while the skeletal muscle is cylindrical. If you look up pictures, you'll see. And the cardiac is kind of in between. The cardiac is kind of in between both of these. And we're going to talk a lot more about that later. But it's important that these muscle fibers, which is when you have a whole bunch of muscle cells together, are all in one direction, so that when they're stimulated, because that's the point of a muscle cell, is they can be electrically stimulated, they can clench, they can contract, okay? So they all have to be moving in one direction. They have to be, so that, by the way, this is where I would go and look at all these pictures side by side so that you can make sure you can identify. If I say, hey, what's this? You'll be able to say, oh, that's clearly a muscle cell, because I can see all these fibers lined up and all the nuclei are pushed out to the very edges, okay? Because the weird thing about these skeletal muscles is all the cells start to meld together and then they push the nuclei to the very edges, kind of like how the adipose tissue does, but the adipose tissue, the cells don't come together, okay? What they do in the muscle cells, so they can have better signaling. Okay, so many things. And then there's some more practice questions to help you study. And then you're ready for labs question set 5. Okay, let me know if I have questions. Bye.